Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. So pardon me, this video we are going to be talking about home rule and the lead up to the Easter Uprising, and then the eventual Republic of Ireland. So let us click here, click there, click like that. Boom, there we go. All right. So video one, we talked about colonizing Ireland. Last video, we talked about nascent nationalism, talking what nation is, stuff like that. And so this video, we are going to be talking about home rule and the response to home rule. Just give me 1 second. The door opened. It, it felt like there was a ghost. I was just sitting here. I was talking, then all of a sudden, the door to the office mysteriously swept open with nobody there. Ooh. All right. So getting back to what we were talking about, share screen. I said share screen. Boom. All right. So this video, we're going to be talking about home rule and the response to home rule, and then ending with the Republic of Ireland. Boom. There we go. So let's look at the home rule movement. So while we have on one hand more radical elements trying to influence Britain leaving through violence, that's the Irish Invincibles. On the other hand, we have more moderate elements working towards self-government in Ireland, effectively a British North America style solution. This was designed as a way to reverse some of the troubles caused by the Act of Union and a response to the land wars. Pardon me. Irish politicians used the land war as a means to convince Anglo politicians, as English politicians, that there could be an Irish solution to the Irish problem. Now, there were 4 attempts at home rule: 1886, 1893, 1914, and then finally 1920. Each home rule bill attempted to create a Canada-style situation in Ireland. That is, Ireland would have its own legislature to deal with domestic affairs. In 1886, this legislature was a single house. In the subsequent bills, they were bicameral, two houses, while still having the equivalent of a governor general, in this case titled Lord Lieutenant, and any laws requiring royal assent. So let's look at 1886 first. As I mentioned, this was the one where the Phoenix Park killings, the Phoenix Park murders, split the Liberal Party, and they would end up losing the 1886 election. In this case, in 1886, the Home Rule Bill then failed to even pass the House of Commons. So let's look at the 1886 Belfast riots, because in the lead up to the election, in the lead up to Home Rule being passed, in the months prior to the votes, Catholics in Belfast were, for lack of a better term, gloating. Catholics would tell Protestants that when Home Rule was passed, then Protestants would be equal to Catholics, or Catholics would be equal to Protestants. Now, to Protestant ears, when they heard that, they're thinking, okay, this is how things normally are. Protestants, Catholics. Now the Catholics are saying, oh, when Home Rule passes, Catholics will be equal to Protestants. But what the Protestants are hearing is, rather than Catholics being lifted up, Protestants are hearing Catholics are going to be equal, Protestants are going to be dragged down. So they felt like they would be losing their status. So what happens when on 8th June 1886, the bill fails to pass? Well, Protestants in Belfast begin celebrating. And if Northern Ireland was in Eastern Europe, this would be effectively called a pogrom. because spurned on by Protestant preachers, some who claimed that the police were brought in to watch the police brought in to watch the parades were Catholics. So Protestant preachers were saying Catholic police are spying on you. Protestants began targeting Catholic homes, Catholic churches, and the police themselves. And what you end up having starting on 8 June 1886 is the Belfast riots. 6 days of a running battle between the police and the British Army on one side, and Protestants, augmented by the Orangemen I talked about earlier, on the other. Now, Belfast was simmering, ready to explode, when the Orangemen attempted to hold their yearly parade on 12 July 1886. So a month after these riots. And here we have from the Illustrated London News, their 19 June edition. Typically, at least for the Illustrated London News, it was a weekly paper. So this was obviously a week after the events. The riots in Belfast, sort of showing what was happening. A month later, Belfast was calming down, but they were still simmering. Things were still simmering, ready to explode. I mean, think of a pot of boiling water, ready to just spurt out everywhere. When the Orangemen attempted to hold their yearly parade on the 12th of July, 1886. Now, the Orangemen, the marchers, deliberately marched through Catholic neighborhoods, taunting Catholics as they marched by, daring them to do something. It's like, come on, you want some, come get some. Which, who knew? 2 days of violence exploded with the police unable, not unwilling, but unable to keep the peace. So that meant 2,000 British soldiers were sent into Belfast, certainly not for the last time, to put down the sectarian violence and impose peace. Between the June and the July riots, you have 31 people killed, hundreds more injured, and over 400 people arrested, both Catholic and Protestant. So 1886 fails due to, in part, what is happening in Ireland itself with the Phoenix Park killings. The Liberal Party loses, and we have rioting in Belfast. Let's look at 1893 and 1914. So by this point, by 1893, we have a loose coalition of Irish MPs, Irish members of Parliament, calling themselves the Irish Parliamentary Party. This is a loose coalition of Irish MPs. Basically, we go back to the Act of Union. We have the MPs from Ireland coming in. And by 1893, they sort of come together in a loose coalition. And by 1893, they managed to hold significant parliamentary power. They held enough seats as a third party to be influential. So they were still able to continue to push for home rule. In 1893, a home rule bill was passed in the House of Commons, but the House of Lords vetoed it, just like in Canada. Well, kind of like in Canada. So House of Commons passed bills, House of Lords have to agree to it as well. So 1893, House of Lords passes a bill, House of Commons passes a bill, but the House of Lords vetoes it. Now, even though it's called the 1914 Home Rule Bill, passes 2 years early in 1912. And the 1912, what will become the 1914 Home Rule Bill, was passed through parliamentary action, particularly the action of future Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And in this bill in 1914, basically they said to the House of Lords, you don't have an absolute veto over this bill. You have 2 years in order to veto it. You have within the next 2 years to veto it. If you don't, it passes. And then in the breach, King George V jumped in. And he said to the House of Lords, look, if you guys veto this bill, I will create more and more and more lords and ladies. And by creating more and more and more lords and ladies, like by giving them land, giving them titles, it automatically makes them a member of the House of Lords, which dilutes the power of the current membership. So the House of Lords were going, okay. We're between a rock and a hard place right now. We either pass the Home Rule Bill, which we don't want to do, or we're going to lose a lot of our current power because the king is going to bring in more members. So in 1912, the House of Lords says, look, we won't veto this bill. It will come into effect in 1914. However, small little events happened in 1914, like the aftermath of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. And in the aftermath of this assassination, Parliament placed the bill on a 12-month postponement, basically saying, look, the war will be over soon. It'll be a short war. 12 months from now, we will pass it. And then the next year, war is still going on. Another 12 months. Still going on. Another 12 months. Still going on. Another 12 months. So that finally by 1920, a home rule bill will be passed as part and parcel of basically the treaty that separates Northern Ireland from the Republic of Ireland. All right. So here we have a political cartoon with respect to home rule. Here we have this is John Redmond. He is the key member of the Irish Parliamentary Coalition. That was the Irish Parliamentary Party, trying to bring home rule, trying to bring the counties to home rule. Connaught, Munster, Leinster, Southwest Ulster, yep, we're with it, but it's Northeast Ulster, primarily English and Scottish, that are causing troubles. At the bottom it says, Mr. John Redmond, full steam ahead, aside. I wonder, will I have this contrary little devil loose the way he'd come back by himself afterwards? Basically, this idea that Ulster, Northeast Ulster, is always going to cause some trouble. So let's talk about some responses to home rule. Because while things were being debated in London, there were responses to what's happening. So let's talk about the Protestants first and foremost. The Protestants in Ulster. And again, Ulster is in the northeast part of Ireland. Now, unlike the disorganized violence of the 1886 Belfast riots, Protestants in Ulster decided that they needed to show London that they were serious about remaining in permanent union with England. And so on the 28th of September, whoops, my apologies, I thought I had it. On the 28th of September, 28th September 1912, Protestants sign the Ulster Covenant. ULSTER, Covenant, COVENANT, signed 28 September 1912. And it was signed by 471,414 men and women. 471,414 men and women signed the Ulster Covenant that pledged Ulster Protestants to stand up against any form of home rule. Indeed, for the men, it pledged them to actively resist any attempts at imposing home rule. And so shortly thereafter, we have the creation of the Ulster Volunteers. Now, if we're looking for the origins of the Troubles in Northern Ireland between the 1960s and 1990s, I believe it will come from the creation of the Ulster Volunteers in 1912. Also known as the UV, Ulster Volunteers. The Ulster Volunteers were Protestant militia groups determined to meet any home rule in Ulster with violence. And it was formed by the core of the Orangemen. Again, we're going back to this Orange organization founded in the 1790s. The core of them was formed by the Orangemen and Protestant veterans of the Boer Wars, BOER Wars. The Ulster Volunteers were led by a Lieutenant General George Richards, who had 30 plus years in the military. And the Ulster Volunteers was a 100,000 man strong unit, drawn from men aged 17 to 65 who signed the Ulster Covenant. The Ulster Volunteers also received indirect support from the Conservative Party and indirect support from members of the military in Ireland. All right, to give you guys an example, on 20 March 1914, we have what's called the Curragh Mutiny, C-U-R-R-A-G-H. The Curragh Mutiny, C-U-R-R-A-G-H. 20 March 1914. Now, the Liberal government at the time was concerned enough about the Ulster Volunteers that military plans were undertaken to secure military depots, military armories, and act against the Ulster Volunteers if necessary. So they came up with plans that basically said, the Ulster Volunteers are going to be violent if we bring in home rule, so we need to figure out what we're going to do if and when we bring in home rule. Now, while the Curragh Mutiny is not a mutiny per se, what we have is 54 of 70 of the top British officers. So there's 70 top British officers in Ireland. 54 of them threatened to resign en masse rather than enforce home rule or to move against the Ulster Volunteers. 54 of the top 70 British officers in Ireland basically said, we will resign en masse if you impose home rule or if you order us to go against the Ulster Volunteers. Now think about it. I mean, you're controlling the military, and all of a sudden, what is that? 70% of your military leadership in Ireland basically says, nope, we are going to leave if you try to impose that. Now, what this did is it showed Irish nationalists, people in Ireland who wanted an Irish nation. It showed them that the power structure, at least the military, would not be the unbiased force that they hoped. And the Curragh Mutiny would lead to the creation of an Irish national or Irish Republican militia to counter the Ulster Volunteers. So that's one example. Another example with respect to the Ulster Volunteers is known as the Larne gun running incident. Larne, gun, bang, bang, running, incident. 24th and 25th April 1914. The Larne gun running incident. Now, the Ulster Volunteers believed that they needed to maintain the popular opinion in England. So that meant that they could not raid British military arsenals for weapons. If they started attacking British arsenals and British forts, that could turn British public opinion away from them. So, with money coming in from England, Ireland, and abroad, the Ulster Nationals, the Ulster Volunteers, spent all of 1913 unsuccessfully trying to smuggle weapons in from England. And so starting in 1914, several higher ranking Ulster volunteer officers started making contacts and going on not quite the black market, but a gray market for weapons. Made contacts and agreed to purchase weapons and ammunition from arms dealers in the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. I want to stop here for a second to sort of remind everybody of what the political and military connections in Europe at this point look like. 1907, England enters the Triple Entente, E-N-T-E-N-T-E, the Triple Entente, military alliance between Russia, France, and Britain. On the other side, we have the Triple Alliance. That is the Empire of Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy. And pretty much it was believed that even before the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, it was believed that any conflict involving Germany, France, England, well, it would have to pull in everybody. Because if Germany attacked France, Russia would be obligated to come on in, which meant Austria-Hungary was obligated to come on in, and a whole bunch of dominoes. So what this meant is that in early 1914, Ulster volunteer officers whose only goal was to remain in Britain was starting to buy weapons and ammunition from Britain's potential enemies in the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. And so on the night of April 24, 1914, Ulster volunteers ferried 25,000 rifles and ammunition into the city of Larne, L-A-R-N-E, that's in Northern Ireland, thereby effectively arming the Ulster volunteers. Now, here we have, and then later, they produced and sold postcards to help raise even more money. And so here we have a couple of the postcards used reflecting the Larne gun running incident to help raise money for future arms buying endeavors. So this was a UV force, Ulster Volunteer. You can see very middle class force sitting there, ties, suits. Uh, and there we go. The poster on the right, uh, gun, there we go. Gun held aloft, uh, the Ulster emblem down there, Union Jack. Let our flag run out straight in the wind. The old red shall be floated again. When the ranks that are thin shall be thinned. When the ranks that are 20 are 10. So trying to pivot to the nationalist fervor of Ulster volunteers. So this is going to bring us to the Easter Uprising. Get to that in a second. Now, before we get to 1916, we have to step back a bit because in response to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers in 1912, Irish nationalists, people who wanted Ireland, Ireland for the Irish, responded by forming the Irish Volunteers. At its height, the Irish Volunteers was comparable to the Ulster Volunteers and had about 180,000 men and equivalent weapons. Now, the problem with the Irish Volunteers was that they experienced a split with the onset of World War I. When World War I happens, when Britain enters the war, the Irish Volunteers sort of have a split. On the one hand, you have those who believe that if they support Britain in the war effort, that will help them gain concessions after the war. On the other hand, the minority opinion believed that now was the time to strike. It was believed that they could secure support from Germany, they could fight for their independence, and let us strike while Britain is distracted. Now, those who decided to strike against Britain, well, they went underground and started planning an uprising against Britain. And this included forming alliances with smaller nationalist Irish organizations and directly negotiating with Germany for support. Again, Britain is at war with Germany at this point. But the negotiations were done through the German ambassador to the United States. The United States at this time, a neutral nation. And these negotiations secured for the Irish promises of rifles, promises of ammunition, and even potential direct support from German troops. Germany even made plans for a potential expeditionary force in Ireland. But these plans were never feasible because of the meat grinder of the Western Front. Germany did, however, promise and follow through with the requested arms and ammunition. Now, the problem for both the Irish nationalists and the Germans was, well, the British were kind of listening in on the negotiations as the German ambassador requested instructions from Berlin. So basically, at this point, you have an underwater transatlantic telegraph line between New York and London. So any telegrams going from New York to London had to go through the British-controlled line to London, and then from there go wherever. The transmissions from the German ambassador were coded, but the British were able to break the code. So British intelligence had a fairly good idea of when the Irish were planning their uprising. And the British Navy went out and intercepted the German ship that was carrying 20,000 rifles and ammunition. But that didn't stop the minority underground Irish nationalists. Remember, this is only a minority. They've split from the majority Irish nationalists who said, let's work with Britain and get concessions after the war. And so the uprising, planned to take place on Easter weekend 1916, that is the 21st to 24th April 1916, went on without German support. The uprising started on Easter Monday, the 24th of April 1916, when 1,600 Irish volunteers seized key areas in Dublin. And similar to the 1798 uprising, so 118 years earlier, the idea was that by seizing Dublin, seizing the heart of British rule in Ireland, that would be a prelude to a general uprising throughout Ireland. And so, although British intelligence had been listening in to the Irish volunteer communications, the timing of the uprising initially took the British military unaware, which meant that key areas, including Dublin Castle, which overlooked the city of Dublin, were lightly guarded. Unfortunately for the Irish volunteers, they're relatively small numbers. They were actually expecting 10 times the amount of men. They were expecting 16,000, but only got 1,600. Prevented them from securing the entire city. And so for the next week, from 24 April to 1 May 1916, the British military slowly and meticulously began taking Dublin back street by street by street. The Irish believed that Dublin would not dare, the Irish believed that the British would not dare use heavy artillery against the city centre. They believed there would be too many civilian casualties. The British military would not do that. And they were shocked when the Royal Navy sailed a patrol boat up the river in the middle of Dublin and started shelling the city centre. The Irish volunteers, also failed to take and hold the railway stations or the port area, which allowed the British to isolate the Irish, allow the British to keep bringing in reinforcements to Dublin. And so what the Irish were forced to do was they were forced to create barricades similar to what you would find in the 19th century in Paris. And so by Saturday, 29 April 1916, the Irish only held several fortified positions in the cities. They held only several fortified positions in the city, and faced annihilation from the British Army. And so they surrendered. It took until the following day for some of the more isolated pockets to receive a written surrender order. Basically, what would happen is some of the more isolated pockets, the British would say, "Oi, you guys surrendered." And the Irish would basically go, "No, you're trying to trick us. We will not surrender." So they literally said, "Look, if we actually surrendered, bring us a written document signed by our leadership." And so it took them several days to receive a written surrender order. But by Monday, the 1st of May, the uprising was over. So literally, I mean, a picture like this would not look out of place in some of the pictures you would see regarding some cities in World War I or even World War II. In the aftermath of the Easter Uprising, 485 people died in the Easter Uprising, with 2,600 wounded. Amongst the killed included 260 civilians, 82 Irish volunteers, 126 of the British military, and 17 police officers. 3,500 people were arrested and detained with suspected ties or suspected involvement in the Easter Uprising. About 55%, so that is what, about 1,800 people or so, would be sent to internment camps in England and Wales and detained for the duration of the war. Yes, not only during the Boer Wars, but also during the First World War, the English used what were referred to as internment camps or concentration camps against some of their own supposed citizens. 187 men were tried in a series of secret military tribunals, secret military court-martials for their role in the uprising. They were allowed no defense counsel. The courts were often conducted by the same men that the Irish were fighting just days before, and evidence for involvement was often weak. A little under half of those who were tried, 90 people, 90 men, were sentenced to death, while the others were sentenced to varying amounts of time in prison. And the executions took place during a 10-day period between the 3rd of May and the 12th of May, 1916, literally less than a week after the fighting ended. Those executed were done via firing squad, as we can see here, and were considered the ringleaders of the uprising. Now, after the first dozen or so executions, they caused an uproar not only in Ireland, but in England as well. And so the death penalties for the remaining condemned were commuted to life sentences. And so by the end of the war, indeed by 1920, we have the passage of the passage of the Home Rule Bill. And in 1921, we have the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which officially splits Northern Ireland off from the Republic of Ireland. So everything but Ulster was given its independence, creating the Republic of Ireland. All right. So that is it for our Irish nationalism lecture. Next week we will be picking up with the Troubles. I will be, as I said, putting a couple of short YouTube videos, 8 to 10 minutes, to sort of give some context to what will be happening, or what we will be discussing next week. Before we go, boom! Again, extend the session. My session timed out. Don't worry, I won't be clicking on anything. Again, great discussion this week. Just remember, talk to each other, not through each other, for the next one. Annotated bibliography due by Friday. That's 2nd October. And then our next discussion, or next written response, due a week after that on 9 October, focusing on the Klan in Canada. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. Great job. I will talk to you guys later this week. So go forth, slay dragons, and I'll see you later. All right, bye.